Okay, so this is Kunama Nigarite, and she is talking about how the EPLF and the Eritrean Liberation Movement inspired so many different liberation movements within East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia. Good morning.
Good morning. So yesterday I got to spend some time with the children. They have a language and cultural program, and we just started talking. And it's important to me for our children to know the context of their history. So the children that were at the center yesterday were mostly Eritrean and some Eritrean Ethiopian mix. And so I wanted them to understand the context of the liberation movement, because they were looking at the national anthem and like looking and just breaking down the words, what they meant and how they were put together. But I got a chance to talk to them and talk about, for example, Mengistu Haile Mariam, who was the leader of the Derg administration, which was the basically the force that came after Haile Selassie in the midst of the Eritrean liberation movement. So that was what we had to combat against. And so I was explaining to them that Mengistu Haile Mariam was an individual who was a leader of the Derg administration, but he wasn't just brutalizing Eritrean people, that there were many Ethiopians that suffered, that sacrificed, that were not just brutalized but lost many lives during the liberation movement. And I'm not talking just those who fell in battlefields, but those who were targeted and assassinated. And I'm talking about university students. I'm talking about spiritual leaders. I'm talking about
So it's kind of like somewhat of an ethnic cleansing.
Well, not only ethnic cleansing, but also anyone that opposed, anyone that didn't seem to be loyal enough to the Derg administration, not the Ethiopian people, not the Eritrean people, not humanity, but anyone that did not seem to be loyal enough, right? And that's subjective, right? Who decides who's not loyal enough?
But it seems like when they say loyal, what they wanted was there was some form of a cultural repression, so that to practice your culture was being disloyal.
Not only that, but you had to demonstrate a certain level of brutalization. You had to demonstrate a certain level of brutalization towards a certain population or a certain ethnic group or a certain national identity, like whether it was the Tigrinya or the the Eritrean people or the Tigray liberation movement, which was within Ethiopia with the Tigray province, or the Oromo liberation movement, or the Ogaden liberation movement. So within Ethiopia there were, during the liberation movement of Eritrea, and still are, a lot of liberation movements that are happening that we don't talk about, and then we can go down to if you go southwest of Eritrea, so Sudan, South Sudan, that movement was mainly led by John Garan, who was unfortunately assassinated after South Sudan and North Sudan had made peace in 2005. At the end of summer 2005, John Garan, after having attended a conference, I believe it was in Uganda, and they had signed a peace agreement between North and South Sudan. So, and his plane or helicopter was mysteriously taken down. Right? It just poof, he's gone. So if you think of like so Eritrea or the Eritrean government, because at that point Eritrea was already liberated and had built a nation and thriving government by then, was also supportive of the South Sudan, and not just supporting John Garan with the liberation movement, but really supporting the peace process between North Sudan and South Sudan. These are things that are not talked about. So given the history of the liberation movement of Eritrea and how Eritrean government has conducted itself, since independence. So Eritrea has been an independent state, has had its sovereignty recognized internationally since 1992. So since then, there are so many efforts that the Eritrean government and just Eritrean people in general have engaged in supporting, peace processes and liberation movements within, the Horn, not just the Horn of Africa, but East Africa in general.
Okay,
like I said, when we
shall
started,
we go ahead and, just for our listeners, go ahead and name some of the more prominent ones? Like I know the Tigray movement, right?
So
just name maybe like 6 or 7. Go ahead.
So, well, actually, I want to spend a little time with the Tigray liberation movement because there's this, I guess I can only call it lie. There's this lie that Eritreans, don't care about the rest of Africa, or they're very arrogant, or they're very, like, exclusive and stuff. And, I remember even in '87, my family had to flee Eritrea. At that time, EPLF was leading the liberation movement of Eritrean people, and TPLF, which is Tigray People Liberation Movement, which was led by Meles Zenawi, was leading the Tigray People's Liberation Movement. But that was also leading the Ethiopian, people's liberation, because at that time TPLF was the only force in Ethiopia, to my understanding. Again, this is my limited personal experience history that I'm sharing.
And what region, like within Ethiopia, were they occupied?
Tigray is northern Ethiopia. So if you think of the Berlin Conference, Tigray is bordering Eritrea. So that's the Tigrinya speaking people.
So is that Badume in there?
Yes, Badume is. I actually walked through Badume when I left Eritrea, and we were sheltered and supported by TPLF, Tigray People Liberation Movement, in the Badume area. When we had to flee Eritrea because of the bombardment, and the Derg administration had basically brutalized all our farming land, and we were no longer able to stay in our home, cultivate our farms, and just feel safe. And because of my dad's liberation movement involvement, he was one of the leaders within the liberation movement, my family was targeted. So we actually barely escaped assassination. I'm talking about the whole family, just someone, or actually a mysterious troop of soldiers walking in and shooting up the whole house, no questions asked. And this was happening to family after family after family. So my mom saw this, and we had to disguise our identity and flee. So in Tigray, by the Tigray People Liberation Movement, we were sheltered for 2 weeks until there was a pathway for us to make it to Sudan. The town that we stayed in was called Shararo, so we passed Badume, and we're in Shararo, which was one of the main border towns. It was a thriving community. There were Eritrean families that had fled and had started businesses. They had restaurants. Actually, one of my cousins had a restaurant, and we were able to eat with them, and then TPLF provided us shelter. And one of my memories of Shararo is that the first day we walked in, and we were so tired. We'd been walking for days and days, mostly nights, because we have to walk at night to be to avoid being bombed by made in America flying jets. And so we were so exhausted, and we were so relieved. And then I noticed these houses that were just like the structures, these stone structures were partly still standing. And then I look inside, there's still remains of human flesh and everything. And I asked what had happened, and they told me a couple of weeks ago there was a bombing of that town, and a lot of families had lost their lives, and some of them they were still burying whatever remains they could still identify and bury, and you could see the parts of human flesh mixed with household, the food was still there, and So that was my first memory of Shararo. So we stayed there for a couple of weeks. We were hosted by TPLF, like I said. You know, so, you know, people don't understand that, you know, when there is like an administration like Derg, which is, which was, by the way, a Marxist military organization led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, it didn't just terrorize and brutalize Eritrean people. There were so many Ethiopian families and individuals and whole communities that were brutalized and dismantled. So I just want the children to understand, you know, their, like, you know, family or national history within the context of, you know, African history. And I think we can really liberate ourselves when we can look at those, because then you can look at, okay, well, so if Mengistu was, you know, had all these advanced military weapons, and where was he getting those from?
Exactly.
So, you know, then we go to, okay, so he was supplied either by the United States Army or by the Russian Army. And simultaneously, so it was like, and people will tell you, there were incidents where they're seeing like the U.S. military going in and the Russian military going out, and vice versa, because he was, you know, they were both offering him, you know, it was like, who can offer the highest weaponry, who can offer the biggest bank for the bang, so to speak, because they both wanted control of the Red Sea. They both wanted control of that Horn of Africa, strategic gateway to the rest of Africa, and he was playing both of them.
You know what the most amazing thing about this whole thing is, like, first, the Eritrean movement, they formed, they got the 9 tribes together, so they cut through all that disunity and all that micro-nationalism. And then after they did that, the different liberation movements throughout Ethiopia began to add on to this group of 9, you know. So it was like a constant unifying effort to kind of, you know what I mean, pulled each small fragmented micro group into a bigger group, and now you look at what it has created, and it's like a wall of resistance from Eritrea throughout Ethiopia. And sometimes it take a common enemy or a common threat to bring this into existence, you know?
Yeah, well, you know, and actually talking about that common threat, and one of my frustrations and my disappointment with the Eritrean, or just the, you know, the East African community here now in the diaspora, is that, like, when I came here and I was 16 at the end of 1990, it felt like it wasn't a hard transition for me coming from Sudan, where we were refugees, but we had a really organized community. You know, we had a youth movement that was doing cultural performing arts. We were learning the history, and you know, my best friend was an Ethiopian, you know, refugee who, like, so when the TPLF, or Tigray Liberation Movement cultural group, came to Port Sudan, I went with her. When the Eritrean People Liberation Movement, you know, performing arts group came, she came with me. And like coming here, you know, at the end of 1990, for the next couple of years during the the end of the liberation movement, we had such a organized effort, you know, because we still had a common enemy. And as soon as independence was accomplished and Eritrea was recognized as a sovereign nation in 1992, like I started seeing the kind of, like, I think, you know, and I see this with a lot of our liberation movements as just Black people in general. You know, we will win a battle and then let our guards down.
Exactly.
And we celebrate for too long, too soon. So when I say that, I could see as a teacher and as a like someone who was in children and youth education and development, I could see that if we didn't put some structures down right now of how do we sustain this momentum of, like, you know, this drive of wanting to work together, this conviction of, like, collective effort for collective good, how do we cultivate that and sustain that past independence? We were going to lose a lot of young people. And for me to now sit here and just, I can't even count you know, the numbers of young people we have lost, whether to gang violence or just drugs and alcohol, and I don't mean like just physically they're dead. We have a lot of them that are still alive physically but are dead.
Yeah.
They're walking zombies because they didn't have that community to hold them and sustain them and show them that they're still beautiful red
Right.
flowers, and they have just molded. Like, it breaks my heart because
Baby,
these for me,
you seen
these
Bastards
are
of the Party, remember? How they showed who the Crips became
exactly
after the Panthers
Yes.
got locked up and they
Yes.
got, kicked to the side.
Yes.
Eritrea has a similar story
Not just
of young
Eritrea,
people.
Ethiopia has those Sudanese, and now I'm seeing it with the new South Sudanese.
see,
They've only
that's
been here for decades,
It's a
and
very
they
similar story, but it tells you what happens when you lose a certain element, and then what happens to the kids, the
and
children.
I could see this
you see.
in '92. I could see this, and I stand up in the meetings. I'm in the back, usually taking notes, because my dad was part of the facilitators of these community building meetings, and I would stand up and be like, "You guys keep going back and forth, and you keep saying you're building this community or doing this for our children. Where are my children? Where are my peers?" And at that time, I could see a lot of the young men were like being targeted.
Right.
And I used to look up to these, like, I'm hardworking, but I'm not the smartest in the block, but they were so intelligent, so brilliant, so creative and innovative. And a lot of them, by the time I finished high school, were locked up. And that's like,
Yeah, that's kind of how that goes. And what I'm feeling like now is that we're at those people you just talking about. We're dealing with a lot of their children and preventing their children from getting caught up. And the thing that goes in that space, that place that they're looking to fill, that they put all kind of other stuff in, I would say, is your history and your culture, your heritage.
Yeah.
Particularly the aspect of struggle, because it shows you how to work through difficulties. And it
Yes.
gives you also discipline. So
Yeah.
that, when you come into this world, America, they have different remedies for stuff you go through, and I don't think those remedies are the best for us.
Yes.
You see.
Yeah, which is why I refuse to do. So I don't know if I told you this, but my master's is in social work. Master's in social work was clinical practice. Was children, youth, and families. And as soon as I graduated, everybody was trying to grab me to be the mental health person for East Africa, HORN of East Africa, which means they wanted me to diagnose and label my children and families so that they can put them in, so they can build a state. And okay. But for me, it's like we're dealing with the population. And when I say that, I'm talking about, Black children and youth and families. We're dealing with systemic brutalization of these children and families, which is impacting not individual person, not individual families, but the collective. So the mental health treatment has to be culturally responsive, it has to be spiritually centered, and it has to be systematically sustainable, meaning it has to combat the brutalization that continues to reign on these children and families. Other than that, I would just be lying to myself if I said I was doing mental health.
That's real. And I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about the aspect of the struggle from the perspective of mental health, but I do see a lot of people who are suffering in that area, and we need to put more energy in that area. Like, Francis Cress Wilson used to talk about, Dr. Bobby Wright used to talk about, like Frantz Fanon used to talk about.
Yes.
It would be interesting to hear you just kind of go through and talk about some of the things, that people are experiencing as a result of post-traumatic colonial disorder.
And that post-colonial as well, because these brutalizations continue to happen. Whether they're happening in Africa or they're happening in diaspora, these bombardments continue to happen.
And then
in
we get a
schools,
diagnosis of, I would say white society diagnoses us with these funny diagnoses without looking at the background from which these people come from.
Right.
So you don't get a full scope. It's not holistic.
Yes.
It's more symptomatic.
And that exactly is my issue. I don't want to be licensed in mainstream mental health practice to add to the labeling. And, it's like you have a soldier that has been wounded in battlefield,
Right.
comes to you as a healer, and you tell them it's your fault that you got blown away.
Right.
It's your fault that you have now pieces of your body missing.
Right.
It's your fault that your mental health is
Right.
gone to pieces.
Okay.
How that doesn't make you a healer.
Right.
That makes you a killer. So I can't perpetuate the victimization of my people for a paycheck. I can't. I just wouldn't be able to live with myself because I am part of that population. I am part of that community and that family, and I understand what they are walking every day. What they're dealing with. So for me, I want to, and we have not just coping but healing and transforming cultural systems that have been tried, for thousands of years.
Yeah. I think that at the root, though, what happens is that, okay, in order for a lot of these ailments that people are dealing with psychologically, central nervous system disorders that people have from war, at the end of the day, we know that we need to stop and deal with the root cause, which is colonialism.
Right.
You could say racism. You could say just white supremacy. You know what I mean? That's attacking all of these movements throughout Ethiopia, throughout Eritrea, not only attacking the movements, but seeking to turn them on each other and against each other.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad that you said, all those different systems, and then you said white supremacy, because all those other systems are just strategies or they're tools of white supremacy.
Exactly.
They're just tools.
Right.
Capitalism is another tool.
And then one more, and we could kind of close out on this one as the part that has kind of crept in. It's been there for a while, but now it's blown up, where you see all of these white images of Yeshua, aka Jesus, and we know this is really the home of the real Yeshua, but now they've replaced his true black image with all these European images, and I think that's another form of, I would say, mental disorder.
Yes.
When the people have taken their deity and replaced it with another people's deity, and it's like, well, man, y'all won a war, but then they won another war because they got their pictures in your homes and in your places of worship.
Yes. That is something that I'm battling with. I've been here for 30 years. Since I came here from Sudan, and to see how the images of deities, the images of whether it's Mary or Jesus or Archangel Michael or Gabriel, all these deities within the Christianity faith, especially Coptic Orthodox Christianity, which is prominent and at least 3,000 years old